debate. So let's start with numbers. Okay, so everybody knows, hopefully you've read it. I wrote the essay several years ago, back in 2013. Numbers prove God, and I was just pointing out that, remember as I said earlier, that there are different transcendental arguments, different transcendentals, and we can kind of group them all under one big one because none of these things operate on their own. Right? I mean, it's not like numbers just exist apart from other things like concepts or symbols or words or minds. Okay? There's no realm of numbers floating out there like Plato thought that don't relate to God or that don't relate to the human mind. There's no sense in which we can speak of language or communication, for example, that doesn't also assume humans and communicators and, well, you could even argue human beings themselves, right? So, for example, if we were to talk about linguistic philosophy and communicating truths through language, right? Language is full of transcendental arguments. This is why some of the presently living philosophers who do work in transcendental arguments, they often talk about language because language is full of this kind of stuff. For example, we assume that predicates and subjects make meaningful connections about things in the world. Right? Subject and predicate in sentence. We assume that the words and the symbols used in the sentences, doesn't matter what language, refer to the same objects or concepts. Now, let's take a materialist test case to show how stupid this is from the materialist perspective. When we talk about, this was what was going on in the debate with Infidel on Boiler Room, the Infidel Pharaoh debate that we had the other day, where we were talking about scientism, and he was saying that the scientific process, finally, after a while, we got him to admit that, yes, it uses logic. Well, of course it does. There's a logical process and flow to the scientific method. Now, is logic itself the subject of the scientific method when the scientist is studying the earthworm? No, of course not. But he's using it. Yes, obviously. So we have, on the one hand, the scientist studying the earthworm, doing his hypothesis, forming his theories or whatever. And then he's going through this process of testing, experimentation, reasoning to come to conclusions, to sort out the true evidence from the false evidence, the control factors from the anomalies, blah, blah, blah. All of this is utilizing logic. Okay. So logic is obviously assumed in the process of scientific investigation. Edmund Husserl wrote a whole 2-volume book called Logical Investigations to show and argue and spend hundreds of pages pointing out how the scientific method presupposes logic. Of course it does. But now it's not immediately under the empirical purview, is it? No, of course not. So what's going on here? How do we explain this? Well, without getting too difficult or deep into, what can be at times very obtuse discussions or debates, just simply put, in order for this process to at all make sense, there's a whole host of things that are being assumed in the process of just something like a scientist going through and studying earthworms to come up with some conclusion. And it doesn't matter whether the scientist knows about this process or he's thought about these questions or not. It's still there, right? This scientist, he may have never had a class on logic, right? Most of the time when you debate these guys, it's like they haven't. They've never had a class on basic logic, right? Because not only do they fail at basic logic and informal fallacies, they're also not able to ask more abstracted questions about logic itself. What is the number 7? What is logic? And what do they always say? It's a social construct. Humans made it up. Now, this is so stupid that it's hard to believe that intelligent, high IQ people believe this. But they do. And they defend it because they need to defend it. Because as soon as they give way on this question, they're immediately conceding the possibility that not everything that exists is material. So they are committed to, guess what? A dogma. Everybody has their presuppositions and presupposed dogmas that ground their systems. Now, the problem is that their system is incoherent. It doesn't make sense why it's grounded. Our system is at least coherent, and it makes sense. It doesn't mean that everything in the system is perfectly explained. We don't know everything about our belief system. We don't know everything about God's actions here and there in the past, but we can offer a justification for why there's regularity in nature, which is something the scientific method presupposes, which is something that no atheist can justify. Hold on a second. The kids are being loud out here in the parking lot. Not my kids, by the way. I ain't no baby daddy. Now, so if we were to think through again, like infidels' approach to the scientist in the lab, the scientist is interested in the pragmatic questions of the things that are before him. Of course, nobody denies this. However, the philosopher of science, and we're engaging in philosophy of science right here, is asking a more abstracted, higher level question about what is going on in this process here. And this is the same process that all scientists engage in all scientific methodology, obviously. What does it assume? Well, it assumes all kinds of things that are not presently under epistemic purview, or empirical purview, I should say. So, for example, when he gathers his specimens, he groups them together according to a category which he believes properly describes earthworms. Right? Earthworms, he thinks, are a existing group of things that he has properly identified earthworms from non-earthworms. Right? He didn't let snakes sneak in there. There's no baby snakes sneaking around. He's properly identified this specific species of earthworm that should be investigated here. He's assumed that he has the ability to operate in the external world to do this, right? That he's distinct from the external world, right? That he's not just another earthworm, right? So he's assumed that scientific method as a process is going to, in some way, teach him, no matter how limited he wants to have it, the scope be, it's going to teach him something about the external world. Right? It's not just a phantasm, right? He's not working with dreams that he's dreaming up about earthworms. He's actually working with, substantial, physical, real living earthworms. He assumes that there is a meaning that's going on in this process, right? Not only is he assuming logic, he's assuming meaning. This process has some kind of there's some meaningful aspect or venture at work here that's going to, in some way, he thinks, contribute to the approximation of truth, right, as it relates to the natural world or earthworms or whatever. He assumes that this filtering method of scientific process is going to, even if he doesn't think his theory is true, it's at least going to contribute to the true being discovered, right? So truth is presupposed, some epistemic metaphysical concept here. Universals are assumed by the fact that he thinks he can delineate earthworms as this group of things, that they all possess certain categories distinct from other groups of things that don't, right? So even if he doesn't believe in universals, and none of them do, 99.9% of them don't, they're still acting as if universals exist, right? That there are categories of things that possess essences. Even though he thinks they don't, they're just atoms in a certain configuration, just random atoms and molecules that just sort of came together in random configurations. They don't have any actual meaning, but we're going to pretend that they do. So are you starting to see the pattern here? Logic, meaning, meaningful connection between terms, symbols, and objects in the world, universal categories, essences, all of these things he does not think they're real. They're just useful tools that we will operate as if they are real, even though they're not. And we're going to explain the external world, even though we can't really explain it. We're going to approximate it. We're going to act like it's a movement towards, quote, truth, even though there's not really truth. Are you starting to see the point here? He acts like a theist. He assumes all these things he can't empirically justify in the midst of this methodology, and he doesn't even know it. This is utterly devastating to his worldview. And that's why he has to cling to assumptions and dogmas that he can't prove, because it would be completely devastating if he were to admit them. It would destroy the entire materialistic assumption, right? Because from the very outset, it is completely self-contradictory across the board. And that's not even all. We're not even done, right? What else is assumed here? Well, it's assumed that this scientist himself has a consciousness that is in some way able to connect events from the past that go into his present interpretation of the worms in front of him, doesn't it? Well, of course it does. All right? He's probably spent 20 years studying earthworms, and his collected wisdom of 20 years of studying earthworms, he thinks informs his present interpretation of the earthworms. And it does. Of course it does. But it does so because the world is not like he says it is. So let's get this key point here, because this is what you're going to see in every debate with an atheist or a non-believing zealot. We'll call them the non-believing zealots. They have a fundamental contradiction between ultimate irrationality and ultimate rationality. This is crucial. Every debate will show this. Every discussion, every atheist will demonstrate this same tension within themselves. Because on the one hand, they need order and meaning and reason and rationality and logic and large-scale meaning to operate out there in the external world on a cosmic scale. They need it. They act like it exists. But they also have to turn around and deny it. That is the fundamental, contradictory, self-destroying, presuppositional critique of all atheistic, materialistic, unbelieving worldviews. They all have the same pattern problem. Obviously, because there are a limited number of options for them to take. And once they take one of the two roads, right? So if we start with talking about how do we know about the world, metaphysics, right? Any of these categories of philosophy, they're already boxing themselves in by assuming things, number one, that are universal, right? They'll assume universally that matter is the only thing that exists, okay? This is a metaphysical assumption. They don't even know that, but they assume it, right? And they'll say, well, yeah, how else could there? Well, there's nothing else. How can we know? What else could we know? Well, here's this entity sitting here talking to me as if he is a person, a being, right, that has rights and is extremely arrogant and prideful about his life. And he thinks that, if somebody wrongs him, if somebody steals his hot pocket, he's furious and he's going to, attack them on their YouTube profile or whatever. Right? So they act like they're a being with dignity, a being with will, a being with meaning, with existence. And yet at the same time, they have to confess, according to their worldview, as we saw in the example of the atheists at the debate earlier that I was telling the story from when I was like 20, everything's meaningless. Now, this came up to Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I mentioned it in my Neil deGrasse Tyson essay. If you haven't read that, go read that. It's a great critique of scientism. That Neil deGrasse Tyson knows this, and he's asked this all the time. Well, not all the time, but he's been asked this many times, and he says, well, this is why we don't believe, philosophy doesn't matter anymore. Who cares? Philosophy doesn't matter anymore. Now, wait a minute. Logic is in the domain of philosophy, and everybody knows this. Okay, nobody denies this. And every atheist, every materialist thinks that they are the masters of logic, right? Logic and reason are on their side. They're the masters of logic and reason. And yet, Neil deGrasse Tyson tells us that philosophy no longer matters. It's been discarded due to the power and magic of the scientific method. Now, this is just foolishness. This is completely absurd. And by the way, I'm glad that everything has been coming out the way it has with not just alternative media or Russiagate or any of that stuff, but are you starting to see the pattern here of everything from the establishment is completely nonsensical? It is completely contradictory. I mean, why is it, for example, that every establishment person, let's say, take Neil deGrasse Tyson, just as a perfect example, this pop scientism propagandist. Now, if he was really interested in the scientific method, wouldn't there at least be one area of big hot button issues where maybe he takes a divergent opinion? But he doesn't, does he? Whether it's vaccines, whether it's 9/11, whether it's anything. He's completely establishment across the board. Now, what does that suggest? That suggests that science and the realm of science does not actually operate on neutrality like it claims.